So, for those of you brave enough or patient enough to delve into the phenomenology of mind or spirit, Geist, um, written by Hegel, welcome. I'm going to read the preface, and when I feel like it, I might stop and say a little bit about what I think Hegel may have been suggesting, or I'll try. Hegel begins, and by the way, this is a translation by J.B. Baille, or Baille, probably. Hegel begins. In the case of a philosophical work, it seems not only superfluous, but, in view of the nature of the subject, even inappropriate and inexpedient to begin, as writers usually do, with a preface explaining the end the author had in mind, the circumstances which gave rise to the work, and the relation in which the writer takes it to stand to other treatises on the same subject, written by his predecessors or his contemporaries. Yes, that's all one sentence. For whatever it might be suitable to state about philosophy in a preface, say, a historical sketch of the main drift and point of view, the general content and results, a string of desultory assertions and assurances about truth, this cannot be accepted as the form and manner in which to expound philosophical truth. So he's basically beginning by saying it's impossible for me to begin. Or at least that you should not accept a beginning for being simply the first in the first in line in a sequence. A beginning, he's saying, always it takes place within this context, and by prefacing one's philosophical work, they're forced to sort of give an account of what was happening when they wrote it, even though the truth can't possibly be conveyed by that situation. The truth is something that's supposedly in the book, right? So he meets this contradiction in attempting to preface his philosophy. He goes on, moreover, because philosophy has its being essentially in the element of universality, which encloses the particular within it, the end or final result seems, in the case of philosophy, more than in that of other sciences, to have absolutely expressed the complete fact in itself in its very nature, for which the mere process of bringing it to light would seem, properly speaking, to have no essential significance. On the other hand, in the general idea of anatomy, for example, the knowledge of the parts of the body regarded as lifeless, we are quite sure we do not possess the objective concrete fact, the actual content of the science, but must, over and above, be concerned with particulars. So he's saying this special science, the discipline of anatomy, is merely a knowledge of the lifeless and of the parts, of the pieces, and that the real objective concrete fact is not made of pieces, but is in fact the living being, the life, right? The animal, that which is animated, not the dead body. The content of anatomy, which is that living body, is absent from the mere specialized science of anatomy itself. So Hegel goes on. Further, in the case of such a collection of items of knowledge, like in anatomy, which has no real right to the name of science, any talk about purpose and such like generalities is not commonly very different in manner from the descriptive and superficial way in which the contents of the science, these nerves and muscles, etc., are themselves spoken of. So in other words, to the extent that anatomy, or let's just say biology, talks of purpose, of telos, they speak of it as a mere part of the system, right? As an organ, a physical organ, um, like the nervous system, the brain, or efferent nerves, and the muscles, um, and of course, purpose. Hegel, I would suggest, is spiritual and not material, but I'll let him say it. In philosophy, says Hegel, on the other hand, it would be at once it would at once be felt incongruous were such a method made use of, and yet shown by philosophy itself to be incapable of grasping the truth. In the same way, too, by determining the relation which a philosophical work professes to have to other treatises on the same subject, an extraneous interest is introduced, and obscurity is thrown over the point at issue in the knowledge of the truth. The more the ordinary mind takes the opposition between true and false to be fixed, the more it is accustomed to expect either agreement or contradiction with a given philosophical system, and only to see the one or the other in any explanation about such a system. So, in other words, normally one reads a philosophy and says at the end of having read and understood it that they agree and affirm the system or disagree, right, with the system. And Hegel's saying that this conception of philosophy by the ordinary mind is not taking into consideration the larger project of philosophy, which is to understand what makes possible these two possible concepts, truth and falsity. How are we capable of thinking the truth, of thinking knowledge, that we could know the true? What is, the larger context within which this sort of cognitive verification takes place? And really, Kant began the science of epistemology, right? And Hegel and the post-Kantian thinkers, Schelling and Fichte and, um, the Schlegel brothers, and in some sense Goethe, though he wasn't really a philosopher, he was more of a scientific poet or a poetic scientist. These guys put Kantian epistemology in an ontocosmological or an ontological and a cosmological context. They really brought Kant's system to life by pointing out that you can't really disagree with Kant, that Kant was sort of describing for the rest of humanity an event in the evolution of consciousness, which namely was his further self-reflexive achievement. And that after this thought, if you understand it, if you read the critiques all the way through to the third, the critique of judgment is sort of the keystone of the whole Kantian system, then something happens to you, right? Your mind, having been disoriented by the Copernican revolution, all of a sudden finds itself again at the center of things, finds itself, in some sense, related to the creation of the world that it experiences. There's an understanding granted in Kant that is lost with the sort of scientific revolution, not just Copernicus, but Galileo after Copernicus. And then Kepler, there's this transitionary figure who's still basically a numerologist, but also a brilliant mathematician trying to grapple with the geometry of the planetary bodies he was observing wandering above him in the sky. He plays with platonic solids before realizing that, oh, they're elliptical orbits, and all of a sudden, there's still harmony, but it exists at a deeper level that one can't simply Newtonianize, understand in a mechanical way. Kant sort of reveals the infinite nature of experience, even while he restricts what thoughts the human mind is capable of having about that experience. I think Hegel breaks through those limits. Schelling breaks through those limits. Many poets and philosophers have gone beyond, and teachers, have gone beyond the Kantian epistemic um, boundary. But it requires a sort of initiation, and the phenomenology is Hegel's initiation. Um, and once you've been initiated, you no longer see philosophy as something either true or false, right? Philosophy is the activity of being in the truth. And one does not, there are critics of philosophy and then there are philosophers, right? And when you're disagreeing with someone else rather than thinking with them in an attempt to continue the dialectic, then, you end up, if you fail to think with, you end up thinking against. And thinking against is sort of running up against a dead world, or that's what the assumptions of one who thinks against begin to become, that the world is dead and that they must confront it with living intelligence. If rather, we assume the intelligence of the other and of what we hear and what we see, and try to not just understand it, but live with it, be in relationship to it, such that we can become together and become with what they are, then the dialectic of truth can unfold. Philosophy can happen, wisdom can appear in our earthly embodied experiences amongst one another, if only we can understand who and how it is. So let's go on back to Hegel here. He just finished saying that the ordinary mind conceives of the diversity of philosophical systems as contradictory. They each mutually exclude one another. Whereas, a philosophical system that has recognized the progressive evolution of truth sees an activity unfolding within philosophy, and tries to participate in it. So Hegel goes on, the bud disappears when the blossom breaks through, and we might say that the former is refuted by the latter. In the same way, when the fruit comes, the blossom may be explained to be a false form of the plant's existence, for the fruit appears as its true nature in place of the blossom. These stages are not merely differentiated, they supplant one another as being incompatible with one another. But the ceaseless activity of their own inherent nature makes them at the same time moments of an organic unity, where they not merely do not contradict one another, but where one is as necessary as the other. And this equal necessity of all moments constitutes from the outset the life of the whole. But contradiction in the case of a philosophical system is not usually conceived in this way. And again, the mind perceiving the contradiction does not commonly know how to relieve it, or keep it free of one-sidedness, or to recognize in what seems conflicting and inherently antagonistic, the presence of mutually necessary moments. The demand for such explanations, as also the attempts to satisfy this demand, very easily pass for the essential business philosophy has to undertake. So in other words, philosophy has this task it has to undertake, that being the history of philosophy. It has to understand, the philosopher today has to understand how the philosophers of the past have taken to be true what they thought was the case, and integrate it somehow with what one today thinks to be the case, to understand how apparent contradictions can beneath the surface of the apparent surface uh, um, world of particulars, there is a necessary spiritual law unfolding, namely freedom, right? So it's not law-like in the Newtonian sense. Um, the archetypal domain, the idea that Hegel will go on to talk about, uh, is that which remains whole throughout the process of development. So even though the blossom and the fruit appear to contradict one another, to have, the fruit to have destroyed the flower to become what it is, in fact, the deeper substance is the life of the plant itself, and the fruit and the flower and the seed and the sun, apparently contradicting moments or aspects of this thing we call the budding, fruiting tree. Um, Instead, the spirit becomes, the idea becomes the whole process together in its moment of ultimately self-awareness. And so, for Hegel, that there is a cosmos always implies a consciousness aware of the cosmos, some kind of consciousness. You know, Hegel will talk about shapes of consciousness, or what Kant called, uh, worldviews, Weltanschauung, like the sort of intuition or first thought we have about what the world is. And imaginative background is what Whitehead, Alfred North Whitehead, would later call it. Um, so consciousness isn't just this uniform thing, like the awareness of objects in the world. Consciousness itself has mutated such that it was in relation to completely, altered universes. So, and which you could also describe as the universe always being in relationship to a different kind of consciousness. So that, of course, the multiverse theories of an infinite series of big bangs and parallel universes is true. It's just that, we can't think of these as random, lacking intelligent ordering and consciousness, because ultimately, from a Whiteheadian perspective, and I know I'm bringing a new philosopher in here randomly, but from a Whiteheadian perspective, cosmos and psyche, or the world and the soul, have always been part of the same process. That worlding and um, experiencing were always bound up one with the other, so that every single um, universe, every single cosmic epoch, as Whitehead would say, has a form of consciousness associated with it. Ours happens to be, well, apparently fully expressed by the humanoid intelligence, by the anthropos, which is not just our species, Homo sapien, as a biological organism, right? But the idea that our organism represents, that it, indeed, I would expect on any other living planet in our galaxy or in our universe, we would recognize as also playing itself out, that there would be this tendency in evolution towards hominization, right? Towards um, a greater complexity and intensity of sensory experience, and especially including eyes. As Teilhard de Chardin, the Jesuit paleontologist, put it, the universe is um, a place in which there are always more perfected eyes emerging in a universe uh, that has forever something more to be, in which there is forever something more to be seen, right? So that sense of having integrated the expanding, mysterious universe and the cosmic horizon is forever beyond our perception, with the need of each universe to fully know itself as it rips itself apart and recedes from knowledge into ignorance and darkness and mystery. The universe is always both light and dark, and that the contradiction is the stress which gives the whole thing motion. And I'm sounding a lot like Jakob Burma here, who certainly influenced Hegel. But wow, I've gone on for 20 minutes here, and I'm wondering if I shouldn't just section this thought sequence off and make a part two for those who want to continue this wild adventure onto page 3. We're only on page 2 of the Phenomenology of Spirit. So, yeah, I'll see you on the flip side.